I think then we'll make it to start. I would like to welcome you all. First of all, the panelists, Dominic Schofield, Laurence Rycken, Eberechukwu Uneze, and Marco Sánchez Cantillo. You are all most welcome at this webinar organized by the World Agriculture Forum. There have been several webinars before, successful, good participation and good discussions. And today we are continuing with that. We will have a discussion on basis of the input of the four panelists in the discussions. And what we are going to discuss today is very important in agriculture and food systems over the world, because we see that the agriculture is taking place and at different places such that there is a profit for the farmers, but also all the other participants in the value chain. And that's a continuous debate. How much of the price consumers are paying for food is coming to the farmer and to the other participants in the value chain? That's a continuous discussion, and it's probably wise to have the discussion also in this webinar. And I'm very pleased to see that there are good speakers willing to participate and to offer their insights, such that we can have a discussion on where to go in the future. Because we are aware that if you go from the soil to the shelf, that the majority of the income is not on the soil, but at the later phases in the value chain. And so we have to discuss how to interfere there, or how to mitigate it, or whatever. But that's the subject of our discussion today. So most welcome, Dominic, Laurence, Ebere, and Marco, that you are willing to contribute and give your insights. And so I would like to make a start, and inviting each of you to answer the questions which we have indicated in the initial presentations. And the initial presentations addressed two questions. The agriculture value chains have become increasingly complex, and there's a growing gap between the farm prices and the retail prices. Why is that? How is that? And how can that be changed? And the second question is, what is the role of trade and aid and market regulations for the impact on farmers' incomes and also the lower middle income countries? What is the situation there? And the third question is, what are the key constraints preventing smallholder farmers from capturing more value from their products? These are the three questions which I would like to see answered by each of the panelists. And I invite first Dominic, then Laurence, then Ebere, and finally Marco. So hopefully, Dominic, you can make a start. The floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rudy. I will attempt to make a start and won't attempt to be as comprehensive as you're indicating, I think, by answering all of those questions, because these are all, of course, questions that we could spend all day, any one of us, unpacking. But I thought that perhaps I would start by saying that I'm grateful to have been invited to participate on this panel and to represent TechnoServe. TechnoServe is a not-for-profit based in the United States. We are working in 30 countries, and we work with enterprising people to find business solutions out of poverty. So focused very much on a range of stakeholders across food systems. A lot of where we got started, of course, was with smallholder farmers, but we've continued to work with enterprise owners and even large companies as well, as they have a weight in the food system that influences both farmer practices as well as what ends up on our plates. My role at TechnoServe is the global director for our local food systems transformation strategy. It's a fairly new strategy that allows us to explore how we can transform food systems to meet the expectations that, frankly, anyone in the street would expect from their food system, and that is that our food systems should be delivering food that nourishes us, should be healthy, shouldn't be poisoning us. the expectation should also be that no one gets exploited within the food system, that those that are bringing value to the food system are fairly compensated for the value that they're bringing. Food systems should be fair. And of course, our food systems shouldn't be destroying the planet either. And there's so many indications, of course, that there's a heavy burden on the planet, negative burden on the planet, by the way that our food system is currently being managed. So our ambition is for a fair and sustainable and healthy food system, and not to set one of those elements off against the other, not to reduce one in order for us to be able to invest in the other, but to understand that there will be trade-offs across of those. And then fundamentally, we believe that that ambition of a fair, sustainable, and healthy food system can't be achieved without a thriving private sector. And when we think of a private sector, it's not just a large company. The farmers that we work with, the smallholders, these are business people. We learned early on, the founder of our organization, when we first started working in Ghana with smallholder farmers, realized that these people are not defined by their poverty, nor by the fact that they're farmers. That these are actually business people. And the best pathway out of poverty is to improve their businesses, to help them to connect to markets, to connect to resources. And to be able to develop the commercial underpinning that will sustain those public goods and outcomes that we're pursuing. I think, Rudy, I'd like to jump to perhaps your third question, the question of fairness, the question of what those constraints are that prevent smallholder farmers from capturing more of the value from their products, at least a fair value from their products, then perhaps some of the solutions there. And I think everyone here, audience and panelists as well, will probably spoken about this both in professional settings as well as in more informal ones. And of course, market access and price volatility is a key driver of that constraint. And we see these, of course, manifest as dependence on few crops, lack of storage, diminished infrastructure, these sorts of things, but weak bargaining power as well of smallholders. There are, of course, infrastructure and logistical constraints related to transportation, lack of storage facilities, and energy access, and so on. But also financial and credit barriers that are linked sometimes to ownership of land, ownership of the resources required to produce food, high input costs, and of course, in many cases, a lack of financial literacy as well. This is that business aspect. There's an element of technology transfer as well, technology adoption, not just knowledge transfer. And sometimes, for very good reasons, these farmers are slow to adopt technology, very conservative about their adoption of technology. This leads often to poor information on market prices as well, which tips that power balance. And in many countries that we're working in, low access to extension services as well. Finally, a lack of policy coherence that drives challenges that are mostly have a policy solution oriented to them. Weak farmer cooperatives, for example, lacking the capacity to aggregate products or access finance or negotiate better prices. And then unfavorable trade policies, high export tariffs, for example, and restrictive regulations. But that incoherence in policy is something that's really important to understand as well. I was recently in Nigeria, and part of the national strategy for improving the nutritional quality of food is large-scale food fortification, adding vitamins and minerals to staple crops like wheat. Nigeria doesn't grow a whole lot of wheat, they import most of it. And so while there's a mandatory fortification process or legislation in place that requires that wheat that is milled in the country is fortified with vitamins and minerals, there's also a policy to restrict the imports of wheat. Because there's a desire for there to be more wheat production domestically. So there's these misalignments in policy. That's just one example. There are many that can also create important constraints. And land tenure and insecurity related to land tenure, of course, are important. But there are solutions and market linkages and digital platforms that help with those. Connecting farmers directly to buyers through e-commerce or mobile platforms can help to improve pricing, reduce reliance on some of the intermediaries that can drive incremental prices up. Investments in rural infrastructure, of course, better roads and storage, access to energies, direct response to some of those constraints, but also access to affordable finance and a particularly affordable finance for women and women farmers. This is important for a whole range of nutritious crops as well in horticulture, not just the staple foods. And there's lots of evidence that shows that women are better borrowers; they pay back, and so it's an important asset in the dynamic of the food system that needs to be harnessed as well. And of course, something that TechnoServe is very involved in, and that is in training and extension services, strengthening the agricultural education, promoting farmer cooperatives, and so forth. So those are just kind of a first shot at your questions, Rudy. I hope that helps to get the conversation off to a good start. Thank you.
Thank you very much. You have a broad experience, apparently, also with smallholder farmers and probably also collectives, especially in the US, but you indicated also very much interest in things happening in Nigeria and other African countries. So it's very clear that you are there working with, in many cases, with poor farmers, not with very rich farmers. But then it is the more important to see what share of the whole value chain is coming to the farmers' fields and to the farmers' activities. But we will discuss that further. I would like to proceed now with the second speaker, and that's Laurence Rycken. And Laurence Rycken is the Director General of the International Dairy Federation, and we are all aware that as soon as welfare increases, that you see also that a consumption of animal proteins is increasing. There's a correlation coefficient of 9.95 between the welfare and consumption of animal proteins. That's increasing. In many places, it's still very low, whereas in other places, it's much too much, such as, for example, in the US and countries in Europe. But it's up to the International Dairy Federation how to develop in such a way that those who are now going to consume more animal proteins are served in an appropriate manner. So I'm very glad that the Director General of the International Dairy Federation, Laurence Rycken, is willing to contribute. And the floor is yours, Laurence.
Thank you very much, Dr. Rabbinge, and thank you for inviting me. And thank you, Dominic, for painting such an interesting and full picture already as a start. I think we'll have certainly good conversations. Maybe some global numbers, right? First, so 1 billion. So the dairy sector globally provides income and employment to many, and the calculation will give you 1 billion. And from that, we see that 12 to 14% of that population lives on a dairy farm or within dairy farming households. So it's a large population that is linked to dairy globally. And then you mentioned just the consumption. So number shows us that 6 billion people, and we know that we are 8.3 billion at this point of time. 6 billion, we provide nutrition to 6 billion people around the world. And so that's a lot of people indeed that are consuming that very nutritious foods. Nutritious because it provides 7 essential nutrients, from protein quality to minerals and vitamins that are essential for growth and development at different stages. And we also know that women play a huge part in the dairy sector globally. So we're really engaged in all of those aspects. So a few words about the International Dairy Federation and why I'm here. So the International Dairy Federation is an association that is already existing for 122 years. And it brings on all the stakeholders. So we bring the farmers, the processors, the academics, the governments, from at a national level together to have those conversations. Some of those conversations that we have here as well today about the financial incomes and how we bring that together. But IDF is really about the science and technology and making sure that we leverage the potential that sits within the sector and to provide standards and methodologies. And I'll bring that back to one of the points about how do we make sure that we have connectivity going forward and making sure we provide value to all stakeholders. I think one of the elements that we also need to consider is that what the sector also provides is what we will call ecosystem services. And that's something that is usually forgotten in all of those conversations. We look at the price, but how do you manage the price, and how do you make sure that the services that the farmers provide to the land is also being considered? And so when we talk about ecosystem services, we talk about the food, the manure, the air quality regulation, the climate regulation, the water regulation, the disease control, the pollination, all of that work that is being done by the farmers and that is being supported going forward. And so that is, when we talk about the value and the prices, that is something that definitely needs to be in consideration with that. And so the IDF, and I'm really proud to see somebody from FAO, IDF works with the LEAP, and LEAP is the standard setting from FAO that looks at environment, and we're looking at how do we standardize ecosystem services and how do we provide that in those conversations and going forward. So when we took a look at all of those conversations, it's really important to make sure that that element is incorporated within. Dominic, you mentioned about policies and making sure there is coherence in policies. I mean, one of the major government the bodies that is working on that as well is Codex Alimentarius, specifically on food safety, making sure that within the trade that's going on, we are able to have coherent policies that are being moved and that everybody works at the same level. Again, something we are strongly engaged in. Sector has always been, and making sure that indeed there are those standards that are providing that platform to be able to do that fair trade and to protect consumers. But again, at the same time, we need to see what the support that the farmers are being able to provide and have that incorporated as well. I'm going to leave it at here at this point of time to see as well for the other panelists to have some conversations, but I'll come later on some of the aspects on how we can move that forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much. You've made very clear that animal proteins are increasingly important, and you mentioned the number of 6 billion people who are affected, and that it is very important that the dairy consumption and the consumption of animal proteins will increase at different places around the world, whereas at other places there is a surplus of animal proteins, for example, in the US and in European countries. So there is the need to have a readaptation in a way such that there is not too much being consumed or too less, which is the situation is in many developing countries. You made also clear that it is not just the food, and it is not just the price of the food and the economies, but that there are other ecosystem services which are important, especially in dairy producing farms. And so that is something which has to be paid, but there is not a mechanism yet. And a fair price requires also the consideration of these types of activities. So thank you very, very much for offering these insights. We'll move on and we continue now with the presentation by Eberechukwu Uneze. He's the founder of the Clyde Frontiers, which is an organization in Nigeria. And I presume that you make some words on what you are actually doing and what is your view on the 3 questions which we raised in this initial presentation. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and thank you, the World Agriculture Forum, for inviting me for this important conversation. So let me start by saying what we do. I work for Clyde Frontiers, and I am the founder of Clyde Frontiers. So it's a consulting firm based in Nigeria, working mainly on agriculture, technology, and energy. Yeah. On the other side, I also a participant in the agricultural value chain on the primary production side of things, and also on the processing side of things. So coming back to the topic of today, which I find very interesting in terms of how do we kind of share the benefits of the value chain in a way that it doesn't hurt the farmers and also benefit those who are the higher end of the chain. So that will require the value chain actors to benefit from the gains that is produced along the chain. And that will require some kind of market interventions require support mechanisms, infrastructural investment, and the kind of rebalancing of power which Dominic mentioned in terms of how do we kind of give more powers and strengthen the position of farmers in a way that they benefit more in terms of the income that is created along the value chain. So that is important, rebalancing of powers. We need to kind of encourage some cooperatives, a kind of how do we streamline things and make sure that the fragmented market is positioned in a way that farmers benefit from their effort and their contribution to the value chain. That also leads me to a kind of position in terms of what the policy trade-offs are. How can governments come in and support farmers? What are the policy interventions? How do we sequence those policies, which I think also require some kind of targeting? Why you also agree that there is problem with coherence of policy, you also need to pay attention to the targeting. Are the right farmers targeted, or just dump subsidies and give tax rebates to everyone? So there needs to be some kind of targeting in terms of the subsidies that are given out. So the value chain also needs to be a kind of integrated if you are to benefit and maximize the gains in terms of the income that is created along the value chain. I think those are important. Coming to the impact of trade on income of farmers, I think tariffs and trade barriers go a long way in limiting access to markets. So trade needs to be in such a way that it doesn't discourage farmers from participating from the broader market. And again, the cost side of things, tariffs and barriers are not good in the sense that it hurts lower and middle income countries, in the sense that importing seeds, fertilizers, and all whatnot. That will, the moment you slap tariffs and restrict trade in terms of trade barriers, then you are hurting farmers already. That limits their access to markets. Again, subsidies and supports, which I think is disproportionate. And if you look at what is happening in the US, they encourage their farmers a lot, but low-income countries do not have that same capacity to encourage their farmers in terms of giving subsidies. So that it kind of discourages farmers from low-income countries and middle-income countries to participate actively in terms of trade and or whatnot. So we need to look at subsidy imbalance and see how that can be corrected if you're looking at a global scheme that can help farmers in that direction. Also, trade agreements, it gives farmers opportunities to access other markets. For instance, if you look at the regional side of things, where Africa is promoting the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, that is a big leap, which gives farmers in the region access to broader market. I take it that some countries have big markets already, like Nigeria. The market is big, the size is big, but then having leverage over other countries gives you opportunity to play bigger and expands your income in a way that it encourages you to do more investment and provide for additional technology that can help you add value across the value chain. So market distribution is an issue. There are a lot of people along the value chain, a lot of middlemen. So that it kind of affects the income that goes down to the primary producers. So there needs to be a kind of, there needs to be a way of providing access to farmers who work at the very primary end of things so that they can have more access to information, have access to the market, the prevailing market prices. Otherwise, they'll continue to deal with depressed prices, and the middlemen, the wholesalers, the distributors, and the retailers will continue to take away the gains of the value chain. So there is also cost to compliance and regulations, regulation costs, certifications. Farmers need these things, but you find out that it's not always very easy for them to get these certifications, and sometimes the processes are not very transparent, and they are discouraged from participating from the larger gains of trade. So that to me is an important thing that needs to be addressed. You talk about controls, political controls, consumer expectations, all of these things. They ramp up cost on the producer, and most times they're not able to deal with these things. We have talked about technological advancement, which I think is also important. Then how do we ensure that fair value addition for all stakeholders? So I have talked about removing the middlemen and giving farmers, smallholder farmers at least, the opportunity to benefit from the grace of trade. That requires a kind of strengthening farmer cooperatives. You need to organize them in the way that they can aggregate value and benefit from that. Enhance transparency of the process, invest more in infrastructure, promote fair trade practices, and educational programs and training for farmers. Again, I've talked about government policies. Policies need to be not only coherent, they need to go beyond mere pronouncement. Like Dominic mentioned, the wheat story in Nigeria. Not that the farmers were helped actually. It was just mere policy pronouncement. So farmers were just dealing with high cost of production, and government ended up not providing those subsidies and tax breaks they mentioned. So it's a kind of pronouncement is different from implementation. They need to go extra step to ensure that those policies, the moment they're pronounced, are also implemented, not looking at it from the coherence part of it. Target properly, implement them, go beyond pronouncement. I think those are my initial points I think I should highlight at this stage. Then as things open up, we'll be able to bring in more perspectives to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It was most helpful, and you indicated that the markets are there, and you have to see how to operate on these markets. And you made very clear that the farmers themselves, as such, have low and weak entrance to the markets unless they organize themselves better. And you mentioned the cooperatives, and at many places cooperatives fulfilled that role to have some power from the farmers on the market. And I would think that that is something which is not only visible, but is also needed at many places in order to have a more fair price for farmers for their inputs and also for the results they have achieved. And it's very important that you have seen that the countries can affect that considerably if they also have a policy, for example, on the farmers' cooperatives. You made also very clear that infrastructure is something is in the hands of government that has to be improved in order to have a better functioning food production system. Thank you very much for this contribution. We elaborate that further, and we will continue now with the next speaker. And I'm very glad that Marco Sánchez Coutillo, the Deputy Director of Agri-Food and Economics and Policy Division in the Food and Agriculture Organization, FAO, in Rome, is willing to contribute and to give his insights and expertise and experience. Thank you very much that you are willing to be with us, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, moderator. I'm pretty glad to be in this webinar, and I also thank the World Agriculture Forum for inviting me to speak at a very interesting webinar dealing with a very complex but at the same time interesting issue. If you don't mind, I'd like to share my screen just to show some slides as I will be speaking today. And if you could kindly confirm that you can see the full screen now.
Yes.
Perfect.
Very
Perfect.
good.
Very well. So let me just then perhaps let me first talk about distributional failures in agri-food systems and food supply chains to set the stage, and then about how policy in particular can be a driver of inequality, but at the same time, the solution to reducing inequalities and increasing value addition. So I will start now by mentioning a report that we launched in the FAO in 2024, last year, is our State of Food and Agriculture report. And that report that year actually came up with that staggering evidence. The global quantified hidden cost of agri-food systems were about $12 trillion in 2020. And this is really something to worry me and to worry many of us. These hidden costs include, for example, health-related hidden costs, which are actually referring to unhealthy dietary patterns leading to increased risk of non-communicable diseases, and are the largest contribution, accounting for about 70% of the total hidden cost. You also have environmental hidden costs representing 25% of the total. Now, the social hidden cost refer to the distributional failures of available food supply, resulting in undernourishment problems in national populations, leading to labor productivity losses that affect value addition, and also refer to the distributional failures in agri-food systems, leading to poverty among agri-food workers, including farmers. Now, the social hidden costs are distributional failures because they actually capture a situation where public policies fail to guarantee a minimum level of decent income despite the availability of resources to do so. While they only make up for 5% of the total hidden cost, they are not negligible. They represent about 600 billion USD. And the social hidden costs disproportionately affect the economies of countries with more vulnerable food supply chains and agri-food systems. Just to confirm, moderator, are you seeing the full screen or the notes?
The notes. We are seeing
okay.
your notes.
So
Just
let
try
me go
again.
this way.
Now,
Yes.
much better. Thank you.
So now I was talking about this social cost representing about 600 billion USD. Now, importantly, this hidden cost, basically is hindering value addition, is hindering an equitable distribution along food supply chains. And a fair distribution of this cost is also hindered by asymmetric power relations, and primary producers often bear the burden of taking action to address this cost. Now, it's important to keep this in mind because, as we say, you cannot manage what you cannot monitor and track. And here we are actually tracking the problem. And another way to track the problem another way to track these distributional failures can also be seen through what we call the food dollar, which has been developed by USDA for the United States, which also FAO is working on, along with the USDA and some other partners like Cornell University, to extend to some more countries in the world. Now, this food dollar is very helpful because it's actually measuring annual expenditures by consumers on domestically produced food. And as you can see in the screen, the bills show different ways to split up the same food dollar. So as an example, on the left, you will see that the portion of the food dollar that goes to farm establishments for the sales of raw food commodities is less than 14 cents. It means that, 86 cents of this dollar goes to post-farm activities. Clearly, every US dollar generated in the food supply chain is not being equally distributed, while there is value addition, of course. Now, again, as I said before, the distributional failures capture a situation where public policies are failing to guarantee a minimum level of decent income for everybody in the value chain. Therefore, it is important to monitor policies. And this is something that FAO is doing on a daily basis for many countries in the world. In this figure, for example, you see the global policy support in the food and agricultural sector by income group. And what is interesting to see here is that in low-income countries, as well as lower middle-income countries, farmers face price disincentives. And this is happening because, the policies and some of the panelists, I think Eberechukwu already mentioned trade policies and subsidies. Some of these policies are actually designed to protect poor consumers, right? Which is not wrong, but it's creating an imbalance somewhere else. Now, what this means is that trade policies and market price regulations are pushing the domestic price that farmers fetch well below the international price. That's a problem. The figure also shows that fiscal support to producers in low-income countries is very, very low. And I think Eberi also alluded to this issue. Therefore, what we see here is that policies are creating inequalities within countries that are particularly affecting farmers, but also across income groups. Therefore, in the FAO, we are trying to address this by supporting countries in reforming policies and also in optimizing policies. And as part of the solutions that I want to share with you from what FAO is trying to do today, we work a lot with governments, particularly Sub-Saharan Africa, to optimize policies. Now, very clearly, policy optimization means that the policymaker compromises to have a policy mix that allows for simultaneous progress on several objectives that are favoring both, not only the producers and the middle actors of the value chain, but also the consumers. So there is a compromise in the policy making. In this graph, for example, we can see the fiscal support that governments are given to farmers in the crops and livestock sectors. But in this case, we are identifying through a tool that we have built to support these countries, the inefficiencies in the way they are promoting the sector. And where are the potential efficiencies? And what this basically is telling me that in these countries, if they were to really find gains for everybody by increasing agri-food output, maximizing jobs for people of the farm in rural areas, minimizing poverty and making healthy diets more affordable, they are actually, supporting the sector with a lot of inefficiency. In some countries like Burkina Faso, for example, they are really expending too much fiscal resources to support seed subsidies, for example, where this is no longer being cost effective to achieve objectives. On the other hand, what this tool is telling me is they really need to optimize by moving all these resources and repurposing them to resources where they will find more efficiencies. Like, for example, in this example, we have a need to put more money in extension services, fertilizer subsidies, and investment in irrigation, and so on and so forth. The same inefficiency in different degrees are seen for other countries, but at the same time, the opportunities to be more efficient. Why is this important for the FAO? Because using the same money, the fiscal resources, we're finding ways of really making a difference on the ground. We're finding that optimizing fiscal support in at least these sub-Saharan African countries not only could increase agri-food output a few percentage points, which will actually be a good reflection of results for farmers and other actors, but also you are creating thousands of jobs in rural areas of the farm, and also hundreds of thousands of rural people could be lifted out of poverty, and millions could afford a healthy diet. So this is some evidence that I wanted to show, and I thank you very much and look forward to the discussion that follows. Thank you, moderator.
Thank you very much, Marco Sánchez. It was very helpful, and you made very clear what the role of the FAO could be to make clear what things are needed politically, but also, for example, in the market sector. So thank you very much for that. We would like now to proceed to the next phase, and that's the policies, programs, and specific initiatives to consider. And you've seen some questions, but there is also the question whether I can address each of the panel members with an individual question, which they may use or not. But I would like to ask first to Dominic. You made clear in your presentation that farmers are very slow in adaptation, and that they are also not very weak in negotiating good prices. And my question is now, how can you improve that? Is that the role of the governments? Is it of international organization? What's your own role? And that's, I think, very important, because Nigeria, for example, tried to eliminate the wheat import, but is that successful or not? So I would like to have an answer to these questions, if you can, Dominic, and I'm very willing then to go further with the other speakers. Dominic, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you very much. Just as Marco said, I think at the opening of his presentation, these are very difficult issues, very complex issues, but highly contextualized as well. In each market, if we look at it from a systems perspective, we'll see dynamics between the ecosystem services, as Laurence was mentioning, dynamics even around specific commodities. And so this interplay is also constantly in motion. It's always reacting to itself and reacting to external stimuli. So there's this kind of continuous rebalancing that is happening, and it's trying to I think as we think about how we as a community, as development partners to governments and so forth, how we can respond to that constant balancing act. In taking a systems approach can often be perceived as simply taking the big picture approach, understanding that all the variables are in play. Others might also characterize the systems approach as just doing a lot of stuff in different parts of that ecosystem, and that's not really a sufficient analysis either. It feels a little bit more like having a GPS on your device and zooming in and zooming out. At one point, you're looking at the big picture and seeing how things are relating to each other, and then you have to zoom in and get very specific about commodities or about even regional circumstances in a particular country to be able to be surgical in how we respond to this rebalancing act, and that can be distressing for people. I've been in so many conversations, as I'm sure many of you have as well, where we start talking about a systems approach, and someone will say, "Yes, but what about this? What about consumer demand? What about access to energy in that particular place," or whatever? And then you say, "Well, yes, that's very important." Then you drill down, you zoom in onto that issue, and then someone will say, "Yeah, but what about my issue?" And you'll say, "Well, that's true." And someone will say, "Yeah, but those two issues are connected." So then you're zooming out again. And this constant zooming in and out is actually a facility that we need to have. It's as distressing as it can be for some, we need to be practicing it, because we need to be iterating the big picture with the specific circumstances that we're responding to, not only to respond to the challenge of fair pricing, for example, or compensation for fair value, but to all of the other connected elements related to the food system, either as a driver or as an outcome, including the quality of the food, the safety of the food, the fact that it is nutritious or not, its affordability. All of these elements are constantly in play. So it seems like an easy question, Rudy, but it's actually one that requires more process rather than a definitive answer on what the solution is. It's the solution as a part of the process. And again, taking a systems view, recognizing that there's a diversity of actors that require diversity of commitments as well, diversity of actions. So the interplay of relationships between those diverse stakeholders is also something that needs to be understood, and also recognizing that there's no one organization that has the resources to solve these challenges, that in fact it must be done in partnership, it must be done cross-sectorally. And I'll just introduce one further challenge there. When you do that, you end up a little bit of a Tower of Babel scenario where people speak different languages, they have different priorities, and there's a reflex to find a common language that is monetization. There's a reflex to say, okay, well, if we could just bring it down to the dollar or the euro impact, then we'll all have a common language. But in fact, and particularly when we speak about smallholder farmers and low and middle income countries where poverty is a driver, poverty is manifested in different ways. And we mustn't fall into the trap of by characterizing things monetarily, then coming up with solutions that are monetary as well. There's a lot of social capital that drives the economies that we're influencing here. So perhaps I'm just offering perspectives on how to address the solution, Rudy, rather than giving you the solution. But hopefully we'll get the conversation started with the other panelists and the participants as well. Thank you.
Thank you. But I would like to see an answer to the specific question: what is your role with your organization in this field, where you see there is an urgent need of better coordinating and better facilitating and better organizing?
Yeah, certainly. So as I mentioned at the beginning of the session, we are a not-for-profit that works very closely with a range of the actors within the food system. We began very early in our in our first work in the 1960s, working with smallholder farmers, and so really focused on increasing the incomes of those farmers. That led us to working primarily on high margin agriculture, on value chains that would, essentially give access to smallholders to containers that would be shipped to North America or Europe. And so very export oriented. That's evolved a lot since then, and in supporting farmers and being a part of the process of technology transfer, knowledge transfer, training farmers, for example. We've also evolved as an organization to bring in the business perspective. And so a lot of the work that we do around entrepreneurship and business development support and so forth, not just the farming technical support, is as a key element of the service that we provide in this ecosystem. And then finally thinking about how value addition happens, to be working with the small enterprises as well as the medium and large ones that are processing these foods, whether that's proximate processing or taking crops and turning them into foods that are nutritious and good quality and safe and so forth. And understanding that many of the food processors in the markets that we're working in have an outweighted gravity in these food systems, that they can, in working with them, influence the sorts of choices that farmers are making. So working with that segment, those agro-intermediaries, to drive regenerative practices, for example, in agriculture further upstream, while at the same time working with the processors to ensure that what lands on the plates of people is affordable and nutritious. So we work across the spectrum, finding entry points as they make sense, to my earlier point, in the contexts that we're working in. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Are there other panelists who would like to react on this statement? No, then I'll proceed now to the next speaker, and I would like to ask Laurence to answer also next to the questions which were already raised earlier. You were discussing very extensively the increased importance of animal proteins. We are aware that in the US, 60% of all proteins is animal proteins, whereas that is of course not very healthy, it should be lower. Whereas in other places, for example, India, it's less than 20% animal proteins, so much more plant proteins. That's quite different. But what is your role as an organization in the dairy industry, coordinating how to develop these markets and how to develop these food systems better? And what can you offer there as experience, but also as mechanisms to have a better diet in the future, which I think is very needed? Laurence, could you elaborate that a little bit, because that's key for your activities as the dairy producers?
Thank you very much. So I'm fully in line with what Dominic said, so that going in and out is very, it's crucial, and it's bringing all of that. And when you see it's a global challenge, but the solutions are very local, and you need to try to find how you work this all around, even if you know there are some things that you need to shift. But in general, it's really those local solutions that we work. And then, of course, just stated all those different stakeholders, all those different points of views. How do you bring that all together? How do you move that angle? So as I mentioned, so our federation brings in all of these different stakeholders, and I'm happy it's only dairy. So I only have one commodity I need to zoom in. But so we bring all of the stakeholders. And so we have had some conversations on that pricing, right? And that is very variable around the world. So you can look at quantity, you can look at composition, you can look at all of these different elements. I just came back from Kenya, where the government has announced that they're going from composition to fat and protein, from quantity to fat and protein composition. So that's going to be a major shift. That's going to be a shift for that. For all the farmers, but also the analytical that works around. How are you going to control of that? How are you going to measure it? That comes a lot with that. So it's really about how do you bring that all in? What is the actual true value of milk, and how do you work around all of these diverse payment schemes? There are as many schemes as there are countries. It's quite variable, and you can look at, like I said, milk components, fat and protein. We can look at food safety, somatic cell counts, and making sure that the product that is being put into the market is safe. A different element, again, who is going to pay for all that? How are you bringing all of that together? How are you measuring that? And you mentioned the consumption, right? So sustainability, environmental sustainability is very at the core of what we do, and we take our commitment and accountability for it. There is a lot of things going on. And again, also within the sector to make sure that we continue to improve, to follow up and all of those elements. And so when we look at how are we going to bring that value in? Again, ecosystem services, as I mentioned before, how do you bring that all in that price? How do you make sure that the value that the farmer is bringing is included? So you can look at, again, milk components, food safety, sustainability, and how do you bring that all together from the lens from the farmer, from the lens from the stakeholders, from the consumer, who is going to pay all of that? So it's really about all of these elements. And then it's about how do we streamline that? How do we provide further? And then comes in innovation and technology. And sometimes it's just pure simple things like milking machines that really make it for the farmer to be able to to continue to grow and to be able to efficient and to provide those products that are needed for the nutrition around the world. So it's as Dominic mentioned, very complex, different angles to be looking at it. And then, of course, from my perspective, from what we do at IDF is we bring those stakeholders together. We have those conversations, sometimes very hard conversations, to see how we can move. And then we share those practices, because again, it's not one size fits all, and who can take what to their home country to be able to improve and to leverage the vast potential that sits within the sector. And that's the platform that we provide to the stakeholders.
Thank you very much. Very clear. And you made also clear that you see there an enormous progress in the way countries are taking the lead in developing that better. You mentioned the example of Kenya and probably also Nigeria. Thank you very much. And we would like to proceed now with Eberechukwu, and I think it's very important, that was already mentioned before, that cooperatives can play an important role. You have some experience there, and I would like to know how you could increase the quality and quantity of activities of cooperatives. What role do they have to play, and how can you strengthen it, both by government policy but also in the market? Maybe you can give an answer to those questions. Eberechukwu, is that a possibility?
Yeah, thank you again for yielding the floor to me. Yeah. So I think you have highlighted an important issue in terms of how do we strengthen cooperatives so that they can do more and gain more from the value chain. So I will speak as a farmer and also speak as a processor. So I will highlight the importance of identifying opportunities and entry points in the value chain. So it doesn't actually mean whether you're using the cooperative model or the community model or the family office model. So, but what is important is that you understand where you need to get into the value chain, understand the opportunities that exist. So from the primary production where I started with as a farmer, so two events importantly affected my decision to move up the value chain. That was the COVID-19. So the market was oversupplied with fresh eggs, and farmers were struggling in terms of how to deal with those issues. So, but because of the fact that there were no cooperatives, everybody was basically dealing with the problems the way they see them. So, and farmers faced a whole lot of challenges as a result of COVID-19. So the other issue is sometime last 2 years, the country Nigeria introduced a kind of cashless policy. It's a monetary policy that was meant to reduce cash transactions in the system. But you have to have in mind that farming is predominantly rural. They rely mostly on cash transactions, and the government introduced this cashless policy, which required reduced cash transactions. And definitely that affected the market, and the egg market was badly affected. Farmers couldn't sell their products, couldn't sell their eggs. So that got me thinking, how can we solve this problem? So I quickly thought that maybe being a processor, developing the value chain and integrating the value chain would better resolve the problems and still increase and improve my revenues as a farmer. So I started thinking about the egg powder production. How do I process? How do I go up the value chain, enhance value in a way that I can also continue to benefit from the value chain? So that's how we got into the egg production, egg powder production. But the challenges there are having the right technology. You don't have the spare parts to deal with some of these issues. You have to rely on going to China, going to Europe to get your machine to produce these things. But importantly, what it does is that it helps to extend the shelf life of the eggs, the fresh eggs. So that also helps to assure incomes for farmers. So what we have done is a kind of be an aggregator in the value chain, not necessarily working as cooperative, but be a value aggregator, where we buy off fresh eggs from other farmers. Then they retain their incomes and they're still maintaining liquidity in the system. So that has given us leverage that we can diversify our products as farmers. You don't need to rely solely on primary production. You need to take additional steps to enhance your products and diversify your product. So not necessarily working with cooperatives, but you can be a value aggregator in the sense that you can help farmers still maintain a bit of leverage in terms of being able to sell their goods and being able to sell their products. So the policy side of things relates that it comes down to the subsidy I talked about and the trade-offs therein. At some point, should government come in? At some point, should government provide additional support in terms of procurement? All of these issues are important, and these are the things that will actually help farmers. Whether they work as family farmers or whether they work as cooperatives or whether they are even community farmers, but it's important for government to provide the right support that will help them deal with some of these issues in the value chain. I think those are the ways we've been working to ensure that we continue to maintain our income stream and ensure that we have liquidity and benefit from the value chain. So those are the issues for me, yeah.
Thank you very much. That's very good and useful to have this observations. But I noticed that Marco, you had also some comments during this presentation. Maybe you can elaborate, because you indicated that you had typical examples how things could be more effective and more efficient. Marco?
Sure. There was a question there that was very interesting about if there are examples of successful policies, programs, initiatives that have helped, in changing the share that, goes to the farmer, which is very, very small compared to the value addition that comes after that. Yeah, I mean, we have many examples. I didn't explain what we do at the FAO, but specifically within the FAO, within the Agri-Food Economics and Policy Division, we have a program that is called Monitoring and Analyzing Food and Agricultural Policies, MAFAP. And one critical aspect there is to be monitoring. Monitoring what? Be monitoring policies. And this is a concept that not many people use. How do you monitor policies? So we have invested quite a bit of time, say, a decade, in developing policy monitoring indicators for some of the countries where these distributional problems are seen today. And this monitoring of indicators is very useful because it actually tells us where policies are going and how policies are affecting the farmers and the distributional issues along the value chain. So to give you an example of how we do this, essentially the FAO established a process with governments, with technical experts, governments that have actually come to the FAO to express a policy concern, a policy issue. And the way we try to back up our observation about that policy issue is precisely by using these policy monitoring indicators. Now, if you allow me to share my just one slide to see an example, I'm gonna share my screen again and basically show you an example that you may find interesting because it actually speaks about this relationship with the government. So we are monitoring indicators. One of our indicators precisely reflects what Eberechukwu was talking about. And also Dominic alluded to policy incoherence, to misalignments, and so on and so forth. This is an indicator that we call the nominal rate of protection for the cotton commodity in Mozambique. And basically, we were monitoring what that indicator was doing over the years. And basically, when you have a positive nominal rate of protection, this basically means that there is a price incentive for cotton farmers in Mozambique, and basically means that the domestic price they are fetching is above the world price. But what we were observing to this indicator over the years, working with these governments in monitoring their policies, is that the price incentives were very fluctuating. They were fluctuating up and down, but in most of the cases, there was a negative nominal rate of protection. What does it mean? It means that due to the trade policies that Eberechukwu was talking about, like import tariffs, but also due to market price regulations, the cotton farmers in Mozambique were getting a lower price than the world price. And there were moments where they were getting very low prices, while at the same time, the international cotton price was increasing. So there is a policy issue there, because already the share of the food dollar that goes to these farmers, it goes even under 14 cents. So as FAO, we analyzed this problem and we came up with a solution. Basically, what happened is that during this period, the government used a price setting formula for the domestic cotton price. And it turns out that there were a few problems in that formula. That formula got outdated. So FAO put the experts to work on this formula. Some of the experts are actually here in this webinar. And essentially, we find problems of transmission passing through from international prices to the domestic price, but also passing through in terms of the exchange rates. So we actually came up with a reform. The reform was a new formula, a new price setting formula that allowed the government of Mozambique to have a fairer price for the cotton farmers in Mozambique. And as you can see here, they adopted the new formula in 2019, and already in 2020, the prices were recovered. What you see in 2021 is beyond our control and beyond the government's control, because there was a large devaluation combined with a spike in international prices. But after that shock, the price of cotton for Mozambique farmers came to the census. So this is an example of policy change, policy reform. And it is important, as I explained at the beginning, that we measure what we want to manage. And this is what we are doing in FAO, working with the governments, trying to understand the policy, measuring policies to come up with policy solutions. Over to you, moderator.
Thank you very much, Marco. That's most helpful. I think we have had a good discussion on the different issues, and I hope and would welcome comments from each of the speakers. But maybe there are also people from outside who would like to have a remark or would like to have some observations. Maybe Ramona, you can indicate whether there are people willing to come in, or is that too difficult?
I think there are several questions in the chat. Some are targeted at specific panelists, some are general. So if the panelists can tackle those, whatever has not been answered already, that would be great.
Yeah. Can you summarize some of these questions, or is that too difficult?
I think there are questions directed to Eberechukwu, for example, on advocacy, the type of advocacy to approach policymakers and politicians with, and also elaborating on the cost of regulation and compliance that affects the farmers, which I think he mentioned at the very beginning. and how that affects what farmers take from the value chain. And there are also questions around whether the carbon markets and biodiversity credits or ecosystem service payments could become a standard way to distribute income more equitably along the agricultural value chain. That's not directed to anybody in particular. And then an example from Kenya on, again, aggregating products from farmers who are certified. And I think I better refer to that a little bit, right? So the producer that also becomes a processor and is therefore an aggregator, and how that helps him or her or them take a higher share from the value chain.
And to who are these questions?
Some are to Ebere, and that's indicated, and some are generic. So any of the panelists can answer them.
Maybe I can
Okay.
Yeah, please go ahead. Yes.
Okay, yeah, perhaps I can answer the question on the strategy of advocacy to approach policymakers and politicians. My answer to that would be that there is no one way of approaching politicians. What you need is patience. When you convene functions and seminars, invite them, find a way to talk to them, get to their constituency offices, write them letters, but you have to develop a good relationship with them when you're working with politicians. So the abusive people, your messaging needs to be very accurate and timely. You need to put it in such a way that it can elicit some kind of interest for them to engage with you. So that is important in your advocacy, the kind of messaging you get out there in terms of reaching out to politicians. Policymakers also find when you're having a seminar on an issue of interest, you think you can provide some policy interventions and advice. It's also important you find a way to reach them, talk to them. They will listen. You need to build a relationship with policymakers. Sometimes they want to take the credit, but what is important is just for you to initiate change and make sure that that change happens. So create that relationship, invite them, reach out to them, know the kind of message you give out to them. That will definitely get their interest to talk about the issues you really want to see in terms of what the direction of the policy and the kind of change you want that policy to impact. So that's necessary in terms of reaching out to policymakers and politicians. Yeah. So do I have another question on?
All right, thank you very much. That was good. Maybe Marco, you can elaborate a little bit because you are experienced in this field, and maybe you can elaborate a little bit on what you were saying earlier on. Sure,
moderator. I mean, I just want to pick up on one of the points that I already put across. How can we approach politicians, right, and institutions? And I like what Dominic said earlier on the contextualization that we need to work on first, try to understand the context and so on. So I'm going to talk to you about a context that I know very well: low-income countries, sub-Saharan Africa. How do you approach politicians, right? I mean, governments need to present evidence that whatever they are doing is providing for people, that economies are growing, that businesses have opportunity. So one of the things we have learned in FAO is come up with tools and innovations that, working with governments, they will understand that they will not be asked to invest more because they have huge fiscal constraints to invest in this context that I'm talking about. But there are ways to increase the value for money. So essentially, that's why I brought up the issue of optimization. There is so much you can do with current public budgets, public finance, that they don't know about. So our job in the FAO is to actually put out that evidence so that they become aware. When you come to them and you tell them, I have a way for you to get more from your money. Believe me, I have found it works. Because they are not being asked to put more, to invest more, to get a loan. So now, from there to the point of what to do with this, it's a problem because you need to compromise. You need to compromise to achieve several things at the same time. We work in a systemic context where you touch one point and then it affects the other. So basically what we are trying to do is to show them that there are ways to use their money better with some compromises, meaning maybe they cannot grow at 5% as they want, because they also need to reduce poverty, but then you show a compromise where they can grow at 4% and still reduce poverty and make healthy diets more affordable. So if you come to these solutions, I have learned that governments pay a lot of attention to the issue. And therefore, I let Laurence perhaps elaborate on ecosystem services, but this takes me to the point, how do you compromise for objectives in this context that are not perhaps, unfortunately, a priority? I mean, imagine you come to these countries where the poverty is huge, you know, millions cannot afford a healthy diet. They're having a hard time to increase yields. Climate change is affecting them and so on. And still you ask them to invest in climate and mitigation or adaptation. You need to compromise, and perhaps the evidence needs to start flowing that, you know, with the same money, you can still invest a little bit in land use, land restoration, and so on and so forth. That is going to be good for ecosystem services. And how is this good for the economy? If ecosystem services affect productivity in agriculture, it's going to be good for the economy. But the point is, bring out that evidence so that they understand that with the same resources, they can achieve much more for the different sustainable development goals. Over to you, moderator.
Thank you very much. I think we have had a good discussion, and it was somewhat difficult to summarize, but what is very clear is that in all the contributions, it became very clear that the issue of how to manage the value chain is an important issue which has to be addressed not only by governments and by farmers' organizations, but also by all the others in the value chain, including the consumer organizations, including also the retail. That's, I think, very important that that should be done in such a way that we are coming to the conclusion that we are directing activities such that the development to health, to diets which are not very healthy into diets which are more healthy, and that requires an inclusion of food systems approaches also in the agricultural sector. That's something which was addressed very clearly. It's also very clear that there is a role to play for governments, and that can be different in their efficiency, the efficacy, and the way to maintain different measures. And it's very important that we are aware that their role is needed for international entities such as the Global Agriculture Forum, which is aiming at contributing to these debates and discussions. I was very pleased with the input of the speakers. That was helpful, and it is probably wise to continue this type of discussion. But for the time being, this is what we could achieve. And I would like to thank you all for contributing and opening up the field for further discussion, which definitely will take place at different places, not only in FAO, but on many other organizations and many entities, which were mentioned also in this webinar. Once more, I would like to thank you very much. We will proceed by summarizing this, bringing this also together with the results of other webinars, and trying to develop a paper which can be presented at the event which we would like to organize by the end of the year, somewhere in October or November. Once more, thank you all, and I would like to close this session and wish you all a good day or a good evening, or sometimes even a good morning. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you
very
much.
much. Thank you very much. Thank you.